When I was a little boy, my fondest summer memories were spending time in the North Woods at my Uncle Howard's. He had this rustic old cabin that was surrounded on all sides by nothing but pure nature. The local hunters called it Howard's Hideout. Every time my brother John and I would visit, a new adventure would await us. But as you grow up, those things fade and you find yourself focusing on the adventures of adulthood. They aren't nearly as fun, and you can't just wiggle your nose and change the story. I wish I could change this story, but this isn't about me. It's about my uncle and the legacy he left behind. Howard died last June from a massive heart attack. I remember John called me at work to tell me the news. He knew I was always especially close to our uncle. A rush of memories flooded over me after I got off the phone. Fishing down at the creek, setting snares along the property line, listening to old westerns as he popped a bag of kettle corn over the open stove. What stuck out the most was the ghost stories Uncle Howard would tell. That evening, John and I went out for drinks, and I asked him what his favorite campfire story Howard told us was. "Gee, bro, I don't know. He told us a lot of crazy things," he said with a laugh. I prodded him for a moment longer, and finally he gave in and said, "That one about the bear." I sat there and drank my own whiskey, remembering the story quite well. Uncle Howard had a way of making the monsters extra vivid in his stories, and none of them were more frightening than the entity that John recalled. According to our uncle, the creature was about as large as a 7-foot-tall man with massive claws that could tear a person into 12 pieces all at once. Papa Bear is what he called it. Apparently, despite being so fearsomely large, Papa Bear was actually not all that dangerous, or so Howard reassured us. "He's a protector of these woods, keeps the good in and the bad out. That's why you boys are safe here. Papa Bear is watching out for us," he said. Apparently, Papa Bear decided who was and wasn't welcome in the woods and eliminated any threats to keep the forest secure and magical. Though I knew that somehow John and I were spared, I recalled every detail of what happened to its victims. Those who trespassed were not simply killed. He made sure to tell us that the victims became slaves to the abomination, tasked to clean the forest that they had defiled. I knew even as a young boy, Uncle Howard was trying to make sure we kept nature clean, but still, it scared the shit out of me, especially at night when the wind would whistle through the old cabin and it would make everything sound so loud, like a groaning noise or a wailing. I remember vividly hiding under the covers one night when the sounds went on for hours. I didn't even get up to go to the bathroom and instead peed on myself just to stay safe. "Who do you think will get the cabin?" John asked me, bringing my mind back to the present. I had to admit I really didn't know, considering that my uncle and aunt had divorced quite some time ago. "It seems a shame to just let it sit out there," I said. Later that same week, I spoke with his second ex-wife Denise on the phone. Our aunt Rena died around the time when I went to college. Denise admitted she didn't really have any idea about the last will and testament or if it even included anything about the cabin, but promised she would look into it. That Saturday, my dad and I went to hear the reading of the will. A few of our other relatives I hadn't seen in a while were there. I even saw Howard's estranged son, Walker, show up. "Wasn't he in prison?" my dad whispered to me when he walked in. "You're the cop, not me," I said back as Walker sat down a few rows ahead of us. "You know what? I think I remember now. It was just a misdemeanor on illegal possession, but they always thought he might have been involved in the Cooper case," my dad whispered back. If you have lived around this area long enough, then you know what my dad was talking about. For those of you who don't, about 6 years back, a family went missing on the north stretch of the interstate near the state line. The investigation into their disappearance revealed that they had been planning a fishing trip for the family into the woods, husband and wife and 2 girls. Shannon, the oldest girl, was the only body they ever found around a year later. Apparently, she had somehow survived that long out in the woods and was trying desperately to reach civilization, but ended up running into a meth lab. The same meth lab that Walker had been busted a few months after her body was found there. I had never read the full report, but it struck me as odd that the timing of the 2 events were so close together. A few moments after my dad made this comment, the cabin was mentioned in the will, and to my shock and dismay, it was Walker that managed to get the property. I followed him outside after the reading was finished and found him leaned against the building smoking. He gave me a lopsided smile. "Brian, it's been a while," he said as he offered me a smoke. "I'm clean now, Walker." "Pretty crazy about your dad, huh?" I told him. He nodded, not saying much. I knew that he had always been jealous of John and I. Uncle Howard had always been much more of a father to us than him, and I was positive that had always rubbed him the wrong way. "So, what you need, Brian? I know you didn't come out here just to chew chud with me," he said. "You going to the funeral tomorrow?" I asked. "Gotta pay respects to the old man," Walker answered. "I know it's probably an odd request, but I was hoping maybe I could handle the distribution of his remains," I said. "His ashes?" he asked with a nervous laugh. "I was just thinking about his cabin out there and how much he loved it," I explained as I tried not to tear up. I knew Walker wouldn't understand, but I was surprised when he agreed to let me have the canister. "You can fling them all up and down the country for all I care," he said as he tossed his burnt cig down. I talked with John about my intentions to head to the cabin that next weekend, and my brother suggested we make a camping trip out of it, a final way to say goodbye to Uncle Howard. We drove up that Saturday morning in the late June heat. We took John's pickup truck, and I remember having to keep myself cool by using a wet rag and some ice because he didn't have any AC. By the time we had arrived, I was sweating so bad, I decided to head down to the creek for a swim. "You ain't getting out of helping me get this shit inside," my brother told me. Even though we both felt like we were going to have a heat stroke, I helped him carry our luggage inside and set it down on the couch. "It still looks like it's still in good condition," John said. I had to admit, I was impressed with the cleanliness of the cabin, and I wondered immediately how long it had been since Howard had been here. He really loved this place, I realized. We looked around at some of the hunting trophies that he had hanging on the wall, and I remembered Howard teaching me how to skin small birds to prepare them for the stuffing process. "Remember that all things on this earth are created to serve men, boy. You don't want to hurt God's creation, and you want to respect life," Howard told me. I saw one of the geese I helped to preserve and reached up to touch the feathers. It was amazing how after all these years, it still seemed in perfect condition. The woods made everything feel even more inviting, like we were taking a trip back in time and experiencing everything for the first time. We followed the West Trail, listening to the gentle singing birds and looking at some of the old snares that Howard still had set up. Once the trail came to an end, we relied on memory alone to reach the creek. The water looked as clear as it had when we were kids. I didn't take a moment to hesitate and toss my shoes off and let my feet relax on the right side of the stream. John took off his shirt and jumped into the deeper portion of the creek, howling excitedly. It felt so good to be here. We stayed down at the creek for about an hour, and then John suggested we do a little bit of hunting. Back at the cabin, I walked down to the basement to find any of our uncle's guns. The basement was in a bit more disrepair than upstairs, but I recalled that Howard kind of used it as a spare closet, storing all his junk there. Near the back of the room, I found a small lock cache where he kept all his rifles and then rummaged through the other drawers nearby for the key. A gentle sound like a whisper seemed to slowly creep into the room, and it made me pause in what I was doing. Then the noise grew louder. It sounded like the noises we heard when we were younger, a gentle, muffling wail. I took the keys and grabbed a few guns, leaving the basement behind and feeling a little unsettled. As we walked out towards the woods, I told John about it. "We're barely here for a few hours and you're already hearing things? Man, I can't wait for tonight," he joked. I laughed it off as nerves or just my imagination. We followed the other trail behind the cabin up toward the mountains. I brought our uncle's ashes along, remembering one of his favorite spots was along this path. It was a scenic overlook of the forest itself and nearby lake. Uncle Howard usually wouldn't let us come up there as kids because of the precipitous slopes. There was one time, though, that he did whenever we had accidentally shot a deer in the wrong spot and it was unfit for eating. I thought we were going up the slope to bury it up. Howard showed me a pit where other hunters also disposed of carcasses. "This keeps the bears happy," he explained. I found the pit after a little trial and error and decided this would be a perfect spot to release Howard's ashes. I held a handkerchief over my mouth and opened the canister, watching as the wind carried them away. Then my attention was drawn toward the pit itself, and I noticed something out of the ordinary. It took me a minute to realize what it was. "Holy shit!" I shouted out as I took a few steps back from the ledge. John was there in a second, and I wordlessly pointed down the slope to where the littered remains of a few bones were at, along with a human skull. "Jesus," John said. He decided to climb down and examine the bones. A few minutes later, he was back up on the slope with me looking concerned. "We should probably call Dad. I can't tell for sure if that was an accident or something much worse," John explained. Neither of us said anything as we returned to the cabin. I almost felt like we were being watched. But once we got there, I decided I wasn't going to let it ruin the weekend. I searched through Howard's freezer and found some thawed deer meat at the top to cook. John was walking around the cabin trying to get reception on his phone, and then finally admitted, "This is what I get for switching to T-Mobile." I checked mine and noted I had a few bars, so I passed it to him and he walked outside to make the call. I walked to the back of the cabin where the propane stove was at and turned on the gas to get everything heated, and paused as I listened to the soft whistle of the ignition light coming on. Beneath that noise, I was certain I was hearing the same wails I heard earlier, and a repetitive, thudding noise. It made me feel very uncomfortable as I cooked and tried to ignore the sound. When John came back in, he told me Dad would be there first thing in the morning to examine the body. The noises had stopped for the moment, but I was becoming more convinced than ever that the cabin was actually haunted. That evening, as the sun went down, John searched through the second-story closets for blankets, and we both agreed to sleep in the living room. "If this place really is haunted, we'll know tonight, won't we?" he said. I stayed awake until almost 1 in the morning, listening for anything. Then, at last, the noises returned. It sounded like gentle footsteps. Then there were voices. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but I instantly woke up John. He switched on the lights in the living room and listened as well. The noises were growing louder. "What the hell?" John said as he felt something under him, but neither of us could see anything on the floor. Then I felt it too, like a low vibration. Nervously, we moved to the second floor. The noises became more subdued, and somehow we found a way to get sleep. In the morning, Dad got there and we guided him to the ridge. "Should we tell him about the other thing?" I asked John as we trekked up the mountainside. "Tell me what?" Dad asked. He always had excellent hearing. "This is probably going to sound crazy, but Uncle Howard's place, it's got ghosts," John answered. Dad looked at us both skeptically, but we insisted he come back to the cabin and see for himself. We all headed inside, and John and I tried our best to explain what we heard. "It felt like something was moving around under our feet," John said. Dad was trying to not roll his eyes. Then the noises returned, soft and subdued like before. He pulled out his firearm and looked about, muttering, "What sort of prank is this?" "It's for real, Dad," I said as we walked around the cabin, listening to the strange moaning noises. Dad made his way toward the stairs, walking carefully to the basement. The thudding got louder as we looked around the basement, and then Dad gestured for all of us to be quiet and still. I was too scared to move a muscle. Then he walked toward Howard's old tool cabinet and started to push it aside. I watched silently as he revealed a large wooden door hidden behind it with a metal lock. The noises were coming from the other side. Dad pointed his weapon at the lock and shot it off without hesitation, and all of us stood there in fear as the door creaked open. A thin, skeletal woman collapsed onto the floor in front of us. Dad rushed over to help her, quickly glancing at the bruises on her legs and arms like she had been chained. "Don't just stand there! Call 911!" Dad shouted to us. John took out his phone immediately as I took a few steps toward the door. There was a dark tunnel beyond that curved into the solid earth, and I found myself stepping forward to see what the darkness hid. As it curved around, I found myself standing directly under the living room in a wide-open den, where more chains were latched to the ground as though meant for animals. The place reeked of the smell of urine and feces. I held my hand over my mouth as I looked across the room to see the decaying corpses of at least 2 other women, and at last, I understood. John followed me down there and then found himself running and vomiting. I found a large cabinet on the west side of the dungeon filled with photographs. I cannot begin to describe the things that Howard made them do while they were trapped down here. The woman that Dad rescued turned out to be the youngest of the Coopers that had gone missing 6 years ago. She did not live for another 2 days due to bladder failure. It's been almost 10 months now since I went to the cabin. I tried not to think about the horrors I found there, but lately they've consumed my every thought. And John, he handled it the worst. Once he realized the true depth of our uncle's depravity, all those times we spent summer there, giggling when we listened to the low wails that whispered their way through his cabin. The guilt made him take his life. I've returned to the cabin now with one singular mission. I doused the entire first floor with gasoline and then activated the stove on a low setting. I sat out in the pickup truck and watched as it burned. It sounded like the cabin was screaming as it fell apart into shambles, like it was in pain. But the pain I feel will always be greater.
No one believed what happened to my father, even after that famous YouTuber went missing for a week in the same stretch of woods. But Dad was the first to be taken. My father and I decided to go camping to help celebrate his promotion at work. He was a seasoned camper, but I was relatively new to it all. We spent most of the day riding our dirt bikes through a few of the trails toward the bottom of the mountain, but when the sun started to set, we decided to make camp for the night. We set up our tents, and I gathered some firewood with Dad. We got a pretty decent-sized fire burning before eating dinner and toasting some marshmallows. When the sun was completely gone, I was genially afraid of how many stars there were. Being from the city meant I was only used to seeing a few stars in the night sky, but out there, away from civilization, it was as if I could see the entire galaxy, and it was unsettling. Further putting me on edge, the sounds of the various nocturnal insects buzzing and chirping was a lot louder than back home. There weren't any howling wolves, but there was the occasional owl hoot. The trees even groaned a little, swaying in the gentle breeze that blew between them. Dad decided it would be fun to tell a ghost story, and for one of the stories, he had to act out one of the scenes. He stood beside a tree, but as he acted out the scene, I noticed something was carved into the bark. "What do you think that is?" I asked, standing and pointing to the symbols. He frowned a little, disappointed I wasn't very interested in his ghost story. He turned his attention to where I was pointing and continued to frown. "I'm not sure. I kind of noticed it before, but I guess my brain automatically assumed it was just one of those Jack loves Jane messages kids like to carve into the trees." He leaned down a little and stood in a way that allowed the light from the fire to flicker off the tree. I followed suit. The symbols had been organized into a diamond pattern, carved a few inches deep into the bark. And it looks like a tool was used to carve this," Dad said, running his fingers along the inside of one of the larger symbols. "It's extremely, Dad jerked his hand back and sucked on the tip of his finger. He chuckled a little. "Well, I was going to say smooth, but it cut me, so I guess I'm a little wrong." As Dad spoke his sentence, the insects stopped buzzing and chirping, the owls stopped hooting, and the gentle breeze that blew through the trees turned into a strong gust. The wind blew some dust into both of our eyes, and we tried to clear them with the back of our hands. We went back to the fire and sat down, but Dad didn't stop rubbing his eyes. We didn't speak for a few minutes, but when Dad stopped rubbing and looked at me, I gasped and almost scooted back. I can't see," he said, blinking a few more times. "Your eyes," I started, pointing at him. I had expected his eyes to be a little red from irritation, but instead, both of his eyes were black now. At first I thought they were gone, but as I moved them around trying to look at things, I could tell they were still there, just completely devoid of color. "Dad, I think we need to go to the hospital or something. Your eyes are completely black, like they're covered in soot." "That would make sense, I guess. Maybe that gust of wind blew some into my eyes. I can't see a thing." "Okay, here, I'll help you," I started, standing up and moving toward him. I grabbed his arms and helped him to his feet. My mind raced with possibilities when it came to getting help. Since we rode separate dirt bikes to the campground, there was no way he'd be able to ride without vision. It was possible we could walk the bikes out and I could guide him, but that would take forever. "Dad, maybe we can walk the bikes out. I can help you so you don't run into anything." "Does that?" But before I could finish, I glanced at the tree with the symbols and was petrified. There, on the bark, about a foot above the symbols, was a set of eyes glaring at us. There were no eyelids, just two eyeballs wedged into the bark as if someone had carved out two holes and pushed them in. What is it?" Dad said, bending down to rub his leg. "Why did you stop?" But it took me a minute or so to formulate a response. I took a few steps back and pulled him with me, and the gaze of the eyes followed us. "There are eyes on the tree," I whispered, as if the eyes would hear me and get angry. "What, like potato eyes? Like the little white things that sprout on potatoes?" Before I could answer, Dad winced and dropped to the ground. He started rubbing his leg even more, and I lifted up his pant leg. Sure enough, like his eyes, his leg was pitch black, including the hair that would normally have been brown. I looked at the tree again, and to my horror, I saw that it now had a leg toward the base of the trunk. I looked at the eyes again, and though it was hard to confirm due to the low lighting and distance, I swore they were my father's eyes. But instead of being filled with love and compassion like my father's usually were, these eyes were devoid of emotion, just staring at me like a spooky wooden doll. Dad started rubbing his other leg, and I stood up, stepping back. I felt guilty about it later, but my thoughts shifted toward personal preservation as I questioned whether whatever was happening to him was contagious. He started rubbing his torso and his arms, and a few seconds later, the tree took on those body parts as well. No, I started saying as Dad started rubbing at his face and scalp. Then he stopped moving, becoming a completely black, motionless figure beside the campfire. My heart was racing a mile a minute as I looked at the tree. Embedded in the trunk was the image of my father, complete with his face, which was now twisted into a morbid grin. I shook what used to be my father a few times just in case, never taking my eyes off the tree. When he gave no response, I grabbed the keys to both bikes and hopped on mine. I didn't care about our camping supplies or bother putting out the fire. Instead, I turned the key in the ignition, sighing in relief when it started. Movement on the tree caught my eye, and I watched in terror as the embedded body strained against the bark. It pulled most of itself out and was only connected at its back by a few twigs and bits of bark for a while before finally breaking free. It never blinked, glaring at me and smirking. When it took a step forward, I twisted back the throttle and sped off, daring a glance every second or so, but happy I'd taken both keys so at least it couldn't pursue me on the bike. I almost biffed it a few times, but managed to make it back to the main road, and then back to my house a couple of hours later. It was the middle of the night, but I banged on the door until Mom opened up. She brought me inside and calmed me down enough for me to try and formulate what I had just witnessed. I tried explaining exactly what happened, but it was too far-fetched for her to believe. She kept shaking her head and saying I was in shock, asking why I had left my father at the campsite. A firm knock at the front door pulled both of our attentions, and Mom opened it. There at the threshold was the beast from the forest that had assumed my father's identity. It didn't say a word, but Mom fell on it, embracing it as if she hadn't seen her husband in years. It locked eyes with me, and my heart nearly beat its way out of my chest. I tried to convince Mom that Dad was dead, and the thing that had come home that night was a monster with unknown intentions, but she refused to listen. I even managed to take the cops up to the campsite the next morning, but Dad's body was gone. The symbols were still carved into the tree, but now there was an additional symbol above the others. Since the cops found nothing and Mom refused to believe me, I had no choice but to move out. A few others have gone missing, and I know they were taken by the same creature, and one day I'll figure out a way to fight them. Until then, the best thing I can do is spread awareness.